After watching Unstoppable, this title came to what Dave Chappelle comedy is and what it represents. Not that it's any different than any of the other comedians out there, only that he's considered by many, including people in his craft, to be the best, if not the greatest of all time. But people who actually do the work, we know what's on the table. We know what players are on the board. We see what things are connected to what. And we've seen these scripts play out in different ways many times over. And what Dave Chappelle represents is this thing called progressive comedy, because people understand that you have progressive politics. And progressive politics it's a script that's written out to play a movie out to only go so far. Why? Because the old genre isn't as effective as it used to be. The old genre of mainstream news used to be so effective, it could influence politics on a level that the newspaper and the radio could no longer do after it was outside of its heyday, its most effective use, that time frame. Democrats and Republicans in what they call the most powerful country in the world represented the political discussion, and in many ways the discussion across the world, being that this country is supposed to represent freedom and freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But for people who have been seeking, looking, asking, understanding, we already know that not only Democrats and Republicans, but the entire system is designed to have a particular effect on the masses of people. So anything that comes from that system is going to be a reflection of its function. The amplification of Democrats and Republicans into progressivism is a more complex version of a system that's designed to suppress, to impose its will on the masses of people. Is that system a more complex version of that? Is a more complex version of that system going to be good in any way? Of course not. So what are the functions of a more complex system? The function of a more complex system is to bide time for the imploding of the old systems, to garner as much support as it can in order to drag out the falling of these towers for as long as it can, to soak as much wealth, resources, power, attention, control, to suck as much of the life out of these programs as possible while they still have what little power that they have. So just like particular politicians are released at certain time, certain musicians are released at certain times, comedians are released at certain times. And how poetic of Dave Chappelle to speak of the releasing of certain information when it's most effective in his stand-up set while he's actually doing that. This is what motivated me to do this, because you're not going to have people speak about this. People are not going to take this perspective, because the majority of people who analyze this type of information, these types of events, are also fitting inside some kind of box that they are either selling to themselves or are trying to sell to somebody else for whatever reason. Progressive comedy is designed to sell you comfort, awareness, camaraderie, relief, everything that we're needing to help deal with the side effects from the onslaught of attacks that come from systems like the mainstream media, Hollywood, politics, and everything that's intertwined within that network. Some of the positive things that I heard mentioned: the Jack Johnson story, Dr. Sebi, Nipsey Hussle, Bill Maher, Israel, the lack of freedom of speech, how you can speak in other countries but you can't speak here, which was interesting to hear somebody like Jimmy Dore lose his shit over in response to that, which is another example of this progressive comedy consciousness that is designed to have an effect on people. Because he, with his chest, wholeheartedly had to defend freedom of speech in the United States over freedom of speech in the Middle East, as if there's something to be proud of. This is the problem with this progressive mindset. Progressive comedy makes you proud of this awareness and proud of people who stand up and say certain things. But what they're not telling you is that they're only saying certain things up until a certain point, with the intention of keeping people from asking those questions. This is why they exist. This is why they're promoted out there. This is why people like Jimmy Dore, TYT, and so on and so forth, this progressive idea, perspective of politics, the reason that exists is to slow down the discussion and censor the discussion, to keep people from going any further than is comfortable for the people in power. So just as elementary school, middle school, high school creates complacent, obedient robots, functional, mechanical, biomechanical robots to produce for this, what they call capitalistic system. These are fancy words for slavery. Once you start to unravel what's underneath here. And they need people, the system needs people to convince people that the story is relevant. You can't convince people if they are too informed. Democrats and Republicans was ran out with the Obama time frame. You can't control people. They learned they couldn't control people with just throwing a black president at you and saying, here it is, this is it. So that was the end of the blue and the red. Entered in the progressives, entered in Bernie Sanders, entered in rappers, comedians into the scene. Why? Because politics and politicians alone weren't strong enough to hold your attention. So they need Dave Chappelle, they need Killer Mike, they need Bill Maher, they need Jon Stewart, they need Russell Brand. They need to assassinate somebody like Charlie Kirk because nobody's watching their programs anymore. Shock value is all they have. And as I said in previous videos, they need to generate villains in order to artificially generate heroes. Dave Chappelle is an artificial hero. Charlie Kirk is an artificial hero. Martin Luther King was an artificial hero. You can go down the list on and on and on and on. This is not to take anything away from these people. This is only to add a perspective to the idea that the narrative, the story itself, is where the power is. And if you can control the narrative, if you can control the story, you can control the velocity of consciousness. You can control how people think about how they move their money, their resources. If you can control how people move resources, then you don't have to be bothered with the particulars of certain resources. See, we're distracted by the particulars of certain angles, to certain perspectives, but never are we allowed to speak, to address the world. We're never allowed to challenge the projected narrative. And this is another thing that the progressive culture, ideology, that why they exist, is not so much to tell you, to inform you on what to think, what to know, what to feel, but they inherently tell you with their actions and with their lack of actions what not to speak on, what not to address, what not to pay attention to, what not to put on the same level of importance as everything else. So if white people are just talking about white perspectives with white people and white scholars and white teachers and white scientists forever, what does that say about so-called black intelligence? What does that say about so-called black scholars? And I'm just using that as an example to talk about the rest of the not white world. This is the intention of elevating people like Charlie Kirk, Russell Brand, Bill Maher, Jon Stewart, comedians, musicians with voices, so on and so forth. This is their intention, because they're telling you, feeding you this idea of positive energy, what you should feel, how you should approach these perspectives. But what they're also telling you, that negative space is also telling you what is not important, what you don't need to pay attention to, what you shouldn't pay attention to. People like Russell Brand teaming up with Erica Kirk on Turning Point and going out there throwing the Bible and Christianity and telling you they have the answers. That's what they're telling you. They have the answers. And when they have the answers mixed in with power and influence, not only do they have the answers, but they are sitting on other perspectives that talk about questions and answers that aren't on the same table or discussion block as the people that they keep in their circles. So what that does is dismiss entire streams of consciousness, entire cultures, entire mindsets. People are categorized into a box. What they did with the stream of consciousness that was coming from the so-called black community was they wrapped it up in this idea of black consciousness and wokeness. The term woke was designed to blanket over information, to generate a culture, to generate a perspective that makes it easier for people to digest not understanding something, because they're dealing with people who are in many ways incapable of thinking for themselves, let alone researching for themselves. So people who can speak and stand on their own and have a sense of self, and who have researched and understood these things, they make people who exist by just regurgitating what they are told by politicians and people that they look up to, that makes them feel insecure and uncomfortable. The people who have made a business out of making sense of it are the ones who have added complexity to a world in order to benefit them at the expense of others. Holding all the resources, blocking all of the true progress, withholding technology, amplifying poverty, amplifying a lack of education, a lack of understanding, ignorance, investing in ignorance, investing in disease. This is not a hidden agenda. common knowledge. If you are in the realm of knowledge, some people aren't. In fact, the vast majority of people are kept out of the realm of knowledge. In order to step into the realm of knowledge, you have to understand the importance and actually activate the mechanism of critical thought. This is an alien experience to what the narrative is designed to keep people at. So, to maintain control over people who are insecure about not knowing, who are only in a space of belief, who are only in a space of following, they need entertainers to tell them how to feel, to tell them how to think, to tell them how to approach what's going on. And comedians are the most effective because comedy shoots directly to your heart. It shoots directly to your core. Laughter is in that same realm of experience as love. So information that is delivered to us with laughter through comedians like Dave Chappelle sits deep. So telling you what to think about, what to talk about, sits deep. Also telling you what not to think about, what to laugh about, what to poo-poo away is also going to sink deep into how people experience this reality. This is why people like Russell Brand are so effective. And like I said, with circles like that, the culture that is selling that along with Hollywood is this addiction culture. So they get you addicted, they push addiction, and then they put addicts, recovering addicts in front of you as your heroes. So you can live the addict experience through them without having to deal with your own addictions. And the perk is to get a political perspective through that laughter, through that connection from a fellow addict. And as the days go along, mind you, this was the whole point, was the manipulation of time through regulating your experience of consciousness. And the masses' consciousness is regulated through comedians, through music, through the education system, through your food, through your pharmaceutical industries, through your belief systems, through your cultures, through your friends, your families. These are regulators. Dave Chappelle, Jon Stewart, Russell Brand, Bernie Sanders, Killer Mike, on and on and on and on. These are regulators of consciousness. They are regulators. All those people at the end of Dave Chappelle's Unstoppable comedy special, how far removed do you think these people are from the Boule? 0 degrees of separation. Why isn't Dave Chappelle talking about the Boule? Why is he talking about Bill Maher, of all the fucking people in the world to talk about? Mind you, like he said, and you believe him even more because he tells you that he's threatened. He feels threatened. By who? By the people who just allegedly assassinated Charlie Kirk. Again, adding to the villain nature, adding to the villainous nature of the villain that they want out there. And again, why do they need a villain? Because how many superheroes are they getting from that? How many laws can be passed after a false flag? Fear sells, but there's something that sells more than fear, and that's comedy. Love sells on that same level. And this is what Russell Brand sells to the masses through this idea of a Christian love, a love from a character, some other storyline that needs to be sold to people who will buy into that. He's for that demographic of people. Dave Chappelle is for that demographic of people. Bill Maher is for that demographic of people. Bernie Sanders is for that demographic of people. The people who need these people. When all these stories, when all these people exist and they tell one story, they create a larger perspective, a larger interpretation of this reality. And that is the narrative. And that is what needs to be controlled in order to maintain control over the masses. And you can maintain that control longer if you control what's being said and what's not being said. These comedians, these musicians, these actors, these politicians, they not only control what's being said, they control what's not being said. And that is their design. At this rate, we might finally start talking about the real American Indians, the real infrastructure of these storylines in 2085. At the rate of information that Dave Chappelle is going from one special to the next, we will finally start to uncover and ask questions about 9/11 in 2054. This is their intention for people like him and the progressive programming itself. Dave Chappelle is not the GOAT of anything more than being the best at keeping people from asking the questions that really matter. And it's so effective when it's mixed in with stuff that you've heard of. You've heard Dr. Sebi. You've heard about the Nipsey Hussle. You heard the word conspiracy theory. You've heard all these things. He's on your side. Meaning people who come from that network can be on your side. That's what Dave Chappelle represents. There are still people in here on your side. And that subconsciously tells you if there's still good people in that system, there's still goodness in that system. The same way they sell you this idea in movies of the good FBI agents, the good CIA agents. They do this in the Avengers, the good ones. There's still good in there. And if there's still good in there, that means the entire system is still worth protecting. It's still good. And if there's still a little bit of good in there, then we're still a little bit of the best in the world. And you just hold that space. You just hold that line. Hold people on that top 40 playlist of this is the best music.
We the best! We nigga!